So we're really fortunate today to be joined by three great provocateurs who are going to help us launch our discussion. Like we did before, we'll have about 15 minutes of a panel discussion. We'll then turn cameras off, have an open Chatham House discussion, and then come back for the panel. I'll remind the panelists now, maybe let's not mention the names of people who made great comments. But we'll clear those names from the other session. So let me bring in Matt first. Matt, Matt Warman is wears many different hats. Is with a group called UKAI. Is the previous AI minister, and is now advocating for how we strengthen responsible AI growth in the UK. Let's start with you. How do we get there? What do we need to have in place? I'm sure you've got all the answers in a short provocation for us today.
If only. So I think my starting point from this is that there's often the assumption that there is this huge tension between ethical AI and sort of implicitly highly regulated AI and growth, which is implicitly fundamentally deregulated AI. And I think history teaches us the opposite in lots of ways. If you look at the success of fintech in the UK, for instance, it was because of responsible, authoritative, and brave regulation that allowed us to try and say, here's what good might look like, here's how we weed out what bad might be before it goes too far into the mainstream. So I think my starting point is that the AI that promotes growth in the right way is also responsibly regulated AI. Now, that in some ways, that's not a terribly controversial thing to say. Obviously, although there are plenty of people that would push back on it, obviously the hard bit is what does that responsible AI look like? Because the advantage that fintech had was you had regulators that had very long pedigrees, that had the authority to say this is what we're going to do, and we fundamentally don't have that in AI, and we are dealing with, rather than London being to some extent a or the preeminent financial market, that's not where the UK sits within a sort of global AI ecosystem. So we've got way more problems than we have with fintech, and we also have the fact that even though a lot of the research suggests that teams that adopt AI and all that grow those teams, it's more jobs rather than fewer, we also know that there is a potentially quite big hump of bits of the economy using AI differently. AI doesn't plug in a neat way, it often replaces some bits and creates others. So you've got a real challenge of a government that needs to respond to a very rapidly changing workforce, that needs to regulate on the one hand, as we were talking about in the previous panel, with appropriate pace, while also not really having much of a clue about what you can do about it. So I think you've got the fundamental tension is between how do you do it in a way that is rapid enough that you don't stymie that growth versus how do you do it in a way that is actually meaningful. And the only answer to that, to me, has to be that you do it in a way that is principles-based, that is bite-sized, that doesn't start saying, okay, let's stand back, we're going to spend 5 years having a review of what AI could do to the economy, and we'll come back and tell you all the answers, because by then you might not have bothered. So I think if I have anything close to an answer, it is to have, I guess, 3 principles. The first is, most of this is already common. It is not, the fact that it is AI doing your HR policy doesn't change the fact that we have a whole load of very well established, don't discriminate on these grounds. So there is a lot of, in the same way that when Uber was first operating in London, it was sort of saying we're a very different company, one of the rules don't apply to us. They spent a long time resisting going to court. When the courts got there, they said, you know what, you're just like a lot of other companies, here's how the law applies to you. So I think there's a big chunk of identify what we can already identify, know what you don't know, sorry. Try and identify what the obvious loopholes are, and there is a lot of good work going on in that already. So for instance, we passed legislation around upskirting and that sort of thing because we knew that there was obviously already legislation against voyeurism, it just didn't cover how technology had changed it. So there's the sort of fill in the gaps, identify what you already know, and that should leave you with the relatively small, easier chunk to identify. And at that point, you have to adopt as close as you can, I think, to an FCA-style sandboxing kind of approach. None of this is revolutionary. None of it is easy. I don't want to say that I'm glad I'm not there, but I wish my successors luck in being ministers for AI and anything to do with the current economy. There are loads of things about how does this time to buy-in from citizens, what does it feel like to live in a democracy where actually, with the best within the world, we don't really believe we're going to get mainstream public engagement in what does the details of AI regulation look like. So this is on politicians to step up and take some decisions. It is also, I think, on them to sometimes say, there are things we have tried to push on to independent regulators, and that is no longer enough. I think people expect big decisions about some of these big issues to be taken by people that they can shout at least once every 5 years in elections, rather than to say, well, Ofcom made that decision or the FCA made that decision. So I think, if anything, that's how you have to start addressing some of the big democratic issues that are essential to get any kind of meaningful growth going.
That's a great way to bring us into some of the conversations that we'll have. That's really insightful. Thank you. I want to bring Anna into the conversation. Anna Thomas leads the Institute for the Future of Work, which I am honored to be one of the trustees of, and is based here in Somerset House, and has been doing really interesting work around what good work looks like, and increasingly what good work will look like in an AI age.
Thank you, Gina, for that introduction and for having me here. And yes, the Future of Work Institute is a new kind of institute, a research and development institute, working at the intersection between policymakers like Matt and academia and practice. And as a kind of loop in, perhaps, from what Matt was saying, we were delighted to work very closely with Matt, actually, in his former role as chair of the APPG. And one of the things we were working on was shifting the debate and narrative around both the future of work broadly and also AI regulation, potentially, towards this kind of reflective, principles-based, anticipatory approach to regulation. And that's been continued in various different ways now, although, and we hope it will be picked up and developed as possibly AI bill next year. And we did that through work, and we did that in particular through a focus on good work. And so that focus entails, if you like, challenging the premise of the question that there's necessarily a tension between productivity and growth and job loss. And our organisation and our work suggests that if you focus on work, specifically on good work, the impacts on work, the impacts of AI on work, what's likely to happen in work, the experience of people in work, then you can cut through. And you can do that in terms of understanding, in terms of anticipating both the good and the bad, and mitigating the bad and bringing out the good, and also responding and actively shaping it, because work is a lens on what's happening. But it's also a door, it's the site of where we are actually responding to it, and it's where we can innovate better, differently, and shape better futures. So the good work, without saying much about it in substance, for us sort of sits as our mission, as part of our organisational mission, and it's become through our work as much a sort of theory of change or a framework for research and a way of translating responsible AI and AI principles into practice. in different ways. We've got a charter, which Good Work Charter, which is available for all sorts of different uses to help us take that forward, if you're convinced by what I'm saying. So maybe some examples of that in my provocation, in the context of thinking about the role of work and democracy in society. So I'll give examples at an individual level, a firm level, and a systems level, because we believe that you have to think about it at individual, firm, organisational and systems level together and their relations, or you're really not going to be able to understand the impacts, good or bad, or shape better futures. So individual first. We very recently, in our smallest project, did some future of work labs, 5 of them across the country, where we were working with young people between the age of 16 and 18 about their experience of not just AI, but their hopes for the future and what their confidence in existing ways of thinking, working and futures. What was clear is that there really wasn't, it was very close actually to what Antonio was describing. There was really a lack of confidence and trust in government and institutions. And there was a real lack of disconnect between everybody, however, had an intrinsic motivation about something, but it really wasn't relating to what they were experiencing or what they could anticipate themselves. There was this massive disconnect. And the kind of risk of outsiders compounding without this was striking. The second example, AI adoption, responsible AI adoption, our project for the Innovate UK and CIPD about we're getting into field at the moment. There are 8 case studies, and we're looking at responsible AI adoption. I can't say a lot about it, obviously, it'll be published next March. But what's really key, and I think I can share just, is that this narrative that AI is a magical answer in itself isn't right, and that's actually being experienced at a firm level too. So people are realising that it's nonsense. Excuse me for giving a specific example. That Copilot is going to solve everything. It's plainly not. Yeah, and also there's not enough space to sort of stop and think and involve people about what's happening and what could happen. And finally, at a systems level, I mentioned that very quickly, the Good Work Monitor this year, we actually linked it, our analysis of the trajectories of access to good work in 202 local authorities across the country, tracking trends. We've done that for 5 years now. Things still compulsory. And it was quite clear that geographically there's huge variation. They're hugely divergent impacts. But also, importantly for this, that really it could be a way of cutting through, that it was linked, that there was a correlation with productivity, and in particular, perhaps for the current audience, it's a myth that access to work is a trade-off with quality work. That's the wrong trade-off. We need to be looking at the trade-off between different types of positive and negative impacts, and anticipating those and addressing them proactively as best we can.
It may seem counterintuitive to think about a panel where we're anchoring these questions around work, where I'm not bringing in the positions around productivity and productivity growth. As a link, I want to bring in Gaia Marcus, who leads the Ada Lovelace Institute, and we really think of Gaia as a champion many things about responsible technology, AI, digital media, a whole incredible remit that you have. But also participation. How do people feel deeply connected and part of the changing economy that's happening? So I don't want to preview your comments, but I want to bring you in because I think these questions around how do we bring this conversation about people feeling a sense of connection to a changing world can be part of how we think about what a flourishing economy looks like.
Thank you, and hi everyone. It's really great to be here talking to you today. I think, so you have kind of hit at the heart of, I think, what will be my quick remarks. So when I was thinking around what it means for the UK to have a flourishing economy enabled by AI, I kind of thought 4 things, which I'll touch on very briefly, and maybe we can pick up in the room. So firstly, just the need to go beyond GDP. The need to clarify the UK's role in the AI ecosystem and actually demand evidence, for example, for kind of claims around, say, productivity gains. The need for a political vision for the role of data and AI in the economy that centres people and their lived experience, which I agree is very much lensed through work generally. And then finally, clarity on the rules of the road, so that we're not all kind of experimenting and basically throwing risk downwards as we experiment at pace. So there are other experts on this, I'll very briefly say this, but I think if we want a flourishing economy, we have to go beyond the current obsession with GDP and this kind of mental shortcut that you touched on, that growth equals tech investment or spend equals less regulation. You know, a flourishing economy is way beyond GDP, and I think, you know, we need to be demanding of our political leaders and others that when we talk about flourishing economy, we're talking about well-being, we're talking about the places that people live in, we're talking about good work. You know, we're achieving equitable wealth distribution, not just wealth flowing upwards at unprecedented rates. You know, we're really seeing, as you say, responsible AI business practices, and also kind of resource management that fits within ecological limits. And I think that, you know, data centres, the kind of claims on water, not just energy, I think might start becoming flashpoints in the UK, or it's much drought in East Anglia. So I think that's kind of our first thinking in this. I think secondly, and I've said this before, and I won't spend too much time on it, but if we want to really enable AI or have the UK in the driving seat of AI, or whatever the buzzword is currently, we need to be really clear-eyed on the reality of the UK's position in the global ecosystem. So, you know, a small number of large technology companies currently dominates the resources and the ability to actually drive, you know, AI development. Our big challenge in the UK would be actually liability. So we are not a nation of massive tech companies, we're mainly a nation of small medium enterprises. We need to think about liability in the supply chain. We need to know that this, you know, we have a kind of regulatory reality or a legal system whereby risk is appropriately allocated to people that are able to manage it. And I think we need to be really clear that we're going to be inhibiting adoption and growth if it becomes risky for small players to be playing in the market. And again, we can kind of talk a bit in the round, but if we are to have a flourishing economy in the UK that really centres on UK strengths, we should be looking to our strengths in assurance, our strengths in audit. You know, we have a lot of strengths as this company, as this country, and it's not necessarily essentially competing with white companies based in California. I think something that we're really spending a lot of time at the moment is, if we are to have a flourishing economy in the UK, we need a political vision that centres people and their lived experience of AI here and now. You know, there's this almost political assumption that the AI revolution, quote unquote, will improve people's lives by making public services easy to access, debatable, by solving societal problems. We've got tools that are quite good at quantitative reasoning. How they're going to solve societal problems is a, you know, mystery, but we'll see where we go. Or, you know, we'll boost economic growth, see above. But actually, despite this political expectation of increasing investment in the deployment of AI, we don't really have a political vision centred in this country's expectations around what AI in the public interest might be, dealing with what tech or digital in the public interest might be, and that actually, you know, corresponds to the hopes, dreams and desires of people we work with. In our own research, we know that in the UK, if you ask people, which you can do through deliberative engagement, they are very keen on pluralism. They are very keen on people not being unduly discriminated against. They're very keen on knowing things are fair. They tend to be quite cautious of profit motives, especially when it comes to the AI in the public sector. So we know a lot about what we can expect. I think the question is actually, how do we translate that into reality? So finally, I think in the UK we really need clarity on the rules of the road. You know, thinking of work, if we think of most people's experience of AI in the workforce right now, beyond a couple of kind of maybe AI or data native companies, we're mainly seeing shadows. So people kind of feeling like they should be using AI, not quite knowing how to do it, maybe using tools that aren't even sanctioned by the company because they're, you know, the free version of GPT or Claude. So firstly, we're opening up our businesses and public sector to a lot of risk, because essentially you are vicarious liability, you are responsible for what your staff do. We're creating a situation where people feel they have to kind of make up the rules because they know what the norms are. And fundamentally, you know, in this country, the single thing that people say that make them most comfortable with AI is appropriate regulation. So I think there really needs to be a national conversation about what appropriate governance, appropriate rules of the road are, and that is thinking about your regulatory system, thinking about governance within countries, within companies, apologies, and then thinking about liability. I'm assuming that's about 5 minutes.
That's great. I'm getting ready to cue those of you in the room up in just a moment, but I wanted to tie a connection because we have research done by an affiliate of the Minderoo Centre for Technology and Democracy. It was done in the heart of Silicon Valley, where public opinion research around AI found enormous gaps between the support, the belief that AI will benefit people's lives. So for people for whom the economy is already working, for white men with college degrees, they are more supportive of AI and they think it will benefit them in their lives. When you go to women without college degrees and women of color, the support for AI plummets. So some of these questions about trust are really being seen through the lens of position within society. Do you think that these tools will be tools that help you get your job done? And do you think the flows will come to you? That said, 59, I think it was 56, 59% of respondents said 59% of the respondents said they thought the benefits to AI would accrue mainly to the elite. This is California, right? Growing economy. This is California where the jobs are located, where economic growth is good, where there's a housing boom. Okay, you have almost 60% of people saying this is a boom that is not for us. That is a problem. Now when we're going to translate that to the UK, what does that mean for the political conversations we're having right now? What does it mean for the conversations if government are saying, you know, we need to go through this difficult transformation, but by the way, it's going to cost your job and your family's ability to navigate through these changes. It's going to be really tough for your family, but it'll be good for society. It's going to be a hard sell for any government. So with that, I'm going to ask for the cameras now to pause, the magic of editing, and we're going to open this up. So we're coming back to our conversation. I'm going to bring our panel in for in just a moment. I want to highlight some of the issues that we have put on the table. One is truly the politicization of AI. We're in a moment now where the geopolitical stakes are extraordinarily high, but we need to have conversations with people, with citizens, with voters, bringing them along into what these changes are, and certainly getting granular on what good looks like. What does a good economy look like? What does a good society look like? Some of the issues that we brought up around that concept were around local, being really, again, rooted in the local situation. Of course, being rooted in the workplace is something that we heard from. We heard that there's quite a bit of regulation already on the books, and maybe we're lacking the political will to pick up on enforcement. That laws and regulations are not being applied, or there's health and safety regulation, for example. We heard that there are these questions around automated decision making that are showing up in law practice, in chambers where people are coming forward and asking for relief. One of the tensions there was really, what are we talking about here in terms of the distinction between private law, so as people enter into private contracts and arrangements, but then also what the state has and the state obligations there. We would be remiss if we didn't bring in a burning question, which was really, what is likely and possible for the UK's position in this geo-economic landscape? What can we do here? And then I'm going to talk about a couple of tensions that we just heard. One is really the tension between telling in a week that this is being filmed on burn it to the ground versus better models of government. And right now, the populism of the nihilists may be winning out. There's a tension between that we heard from about, of course, productivity and regulation. But then I want to put on the table really that we have this tension around, what that kind of looks like, right? That connectivity and people's access to even being a part of that conversation around productivity is still there. So these questions around agency, around competency, and around human relationships are things we have to keep in play when we're thinking about what a thriving economy looks like. So with that, I want to bring our panel in for just what they want to respond to. And maybe I'll start first with Gaia.
Thank you. These are my notes, so apologies. You started us off with a provocation of what it will take to get us where we're going. And I think the first thing I really want to bring away is there's a lack of clarity on where it is that we're going. And I think from the what is good questions in the room, I think there's a shared understanding that where we are going needs to be something that sits within our value systems. And that really good provocation around we should be talking to people locally in their local area around various flavors of AI or not AI, or that means the local area. Really want to second that. It's actually what Ada is kicking off. We'd be really keen to work with you on that. I think on that question of the general question of regulation that we've been having, I think one of the struggles with AI is often it feels like it's everything all the time everywhere. And so I think where you think about the deployment layer, I would agree there are rules existing and they need enforcing, right? I think what we don't quite have the either international or national systems to get to, although there's been steady progress over the past 7 years, is actually the non-territorial nature of the AI value chain. And so this idea that you have, if you're thinking about generative AI at least, you have risks that are being basically baked in at the foundation model. And at the moment we are still in a situation where companies are more or less responsible for just marking their own homework. And where there have been international instances of family supplies, like the Warman principles, they reflect what companies are focusing on in their own safety models, which tends to be like existential or extreme risk, and doesn't necessarily correspond to the harms that we're already seeing in our own populations around discrimination or black box decision making. So I think there is something there which is, we do have a missing part of our international legal system, and whilst there have been steps made there, we know how to deal with supply chains, and we should be really asking the question of, are we appropriately treating the AI ecosystem as a supply chain? And just finally on that, I do think there's a role to play for middle countries. There are a lot of middle countries. So I don't think there's definitely a first mover disadvantage in this. I don't think it's for middle countries to go alone. But there are more middle countries than not, frankly, right? So there is that real question of, what do you want to permit within your boundaries and within your borders? And are you able to drive sufficient action at the international stage? Either at regulation, but also governance standards. There's a lot of ways to skin this, where maybe you are going head to head with nation states, which is hard at the moment, and you are saying to companies, you want to open our markets, cool, these are our rules. And I think that's the conversation we need to be exploring at the moment.
And speaking of those rules, I'm going to bring Anna in to talk on her reflections to our conversation.
There's far too much to say. And in response to hearing, wonderful questions and things that we can't speak to yet, but we can take with us and reflect on together, hopefully. I think I'd like to end by talking about regulation, because we kept looping back to that, and it's a common theme. And also, it kind of links one of the questions at the end from Roger with one of the questions at the beginning about whether or not our current approach to regulation in place now is enough. When I say regulation, I mean it kind of big. So of course you've got to think about the acts going through Parliament, the bills going through Parliament, and there's a lot going through, and a lot going that's relevant. It's not just the AI bill, it's also the Employment Rights Bill. It's the Equality, it's the updates to the Equality Act, it's the Devolution Act, it's the procurement framework. There's a lot happening. But we have, of course, got to think about enforcement. We've got to think about understanding. We've got to think about shared aims and capabilities to implement it and bring the best out of it, kind of smart regulation. Just the point, it's partly because it came first, and I only wrote notes for the first couple of questions. But the question about the point made powerfully, not just once, that there was an existing regime, it was all fine, but we couldn't enforce it, is one that I do think needs reflection on. And also work, and thinking about it in the workplace can really shed light on it. Because as actually that when Roger Taylor chaired the CDI bias review, we surfaced that a long time ago when I was also involved in that 5 years ago, and we said then, we did a gap analysis and highlighted that there were things that were missing in the context then of equality. Then I quite rightly thought that our job is done, I can stand back. And also the gist of that report, which again perhaps needs a reread now, is that it did certainly need at least a clarification in the context of AI. And it wouldn't really, there were risks there, so we had to see if basically the steering group, we had to see if that happened voluntarily. Of course, I was a little more pessimistic than others on the steering group. And if they hadn't, it would need regulation. Yeah. And so that goes back to that first point about it. We've also at the same time done a sort of gap analysis with Mind the Gap, really quite carefully with a sort of multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder group, and found that certainly in some areas that are particularly significant in the context of the workplace, are to do with accessing the right information that you need in order to be able to think about current and future impacts, to have half a hope of being able to enforce it, are the bits that are missing. So, micro, that goes back to the principles approach, and one of the best things about principles approach, the risk of trying to answer too many questions in one go, because to have a principles-based approach, which is not incompatible with a rights-based approach at all, number 3, requires you to think about your purpose, requires you to reflect constantly, on applications. It invites you to do it in stages, to think about how they apply in different domains, for example. To enable the ICO to continue their excellent work with very specific advice in this area, making the best of what we have. That I guess is my party piece. Thinking macro and things that we can do right now, and looping back to sort of the good work as I would, there are things which would require kind of anticipation of workplace impacts in really key areas. We've even got a regulation law, the good work out with a big impact assessment in a sandbox to try it out. So let's get behind it and step it up at this moment in time when the Work Secretary of State, Liz Kendall, has just been appointed as Secretary of State for Decent, which makes it very timely.
Yes, in a week of lots of news. That's a good moment to bring Matt into the conversation. Matt, your comments.
Yeah, no, I think it's really much on that sort of is burn it down winning versus sort of pragmatic action. I lost my seat to Richard Tice. I feel very viscerally that burn it down is winning. But I think that should supercharge the idea that we have to make this conversation. And I think that idea is made harder by the way you make it real, is to really go hard on adoption. Is how do you say to someone, AI is helping analyse your consultation responses, or AI is about to start to impact this sector rather than something else. It has to be something that people have to engage in rather than something that people want to talk about because it's an interesting conversation down the pub. What can government do on some of that stuff? I think there are two things. I think insofar as government has resources to direct some of this stuff, we should be thinking about what are the very worst jobs what is the 21st century equivalent of being a chimney sweep, where it is associated with in that case, with child abuse and cancer. Like, those are the things where government should be trying to say technology can help improve the quality of work at a really, really fundamental level. Now, there are obviously different ways of doing that, but we've got to direct resources somewhere, and I would say try and do it in something that is really pragmatic. I'm using an extreme example, but I think you get the gist. The other bit of it is to say, this question about an enforcement gap, for me, isn't a question about enforcement, it's a question about trust and faith and democracy itself, right? We've had, and obviously I'm a massive hypocrite for saying this full stop, but we've had politicians for a long, long time saying, this is what we're going to do, and then, with the best will in the world, not being able to deliver it. I don't doubt that David Cameron wanted to get immigration down, but he didn't do it, and we spent years and years trying and failing to deliver on that. So it's not about saying we've got laws and we're going to enforce them, it's about saying we're making promises and we're going to deliver on those promises. So you have to have enforcement matching the rhetoric, and you have to have the legislation matching what that actually means. So I guess I have two final thoughts. My first is we cannot rely on legislation, because I think it's touching that people think an AI bill is coming very soon. It isn't. And that's partly because it's really hard. Like, the government is rightly sitting there saying there are always unintended consequences, we don't want to screw this up. And also, it will be a huge, great Christmas tree. It will, every single backbench MP's small idea will get hung off an AI bill if they possibly can. So government will be really nervous about all of that. So it does have to be about how do politicians lean on enforcement bodies to actually enforce. And I think that might be a little bit of how do you get some of that trust back. I think also there are other organisations in this. I think who is doing, for instance, I think right now, where a lot of people said unions have a big role to play in, it's about representing workers, about not necessarily resisting absolutely everything. I think that's absolutely right. But it is on unions to not lose touch with the public as well. The RMT right now is doing, to my mind, huge damage to the union cause. I think we should be interested today, literally. So I think we should be interested in what are all the organisations that might be able to think how society moves forward on this, rather than necessarily thinking it is solely on government. But a lot of that has to be about a bigger conversation that will only happen if people see AI have a real impact on their own lives. So maybe ultimately we do have to be somewhat experimental when it comes to allowing things out into the wild and seeing adoption, which is big and brave and hard and dangerous.
Will you please join me in thanking this panel?